For centuries, the Great Pyramid has been studied as a monument defined by what rises above the desert. Its scale, geometry, and external form have dominated historical analysis, architectural debate, and popular imagination. The structure is measured by its height, its base, and its alignment with the cardinal points. Everything about it seems to point upward, toward precision, symmetry, and control. But structures of this scale are never defined only by what is visible. Beneath every massive construction lies an unseen counterpart. A foundation not meant to impress, but to function. A hidden volume of stone, pressure, and structural logic that carries the true weight of the monument. In most ancient constructions, this lower layer follows predictable rules. It mirrors the form above. It distributes mass evenly. It avoids unnecessary voids, weaknesses, or irregularities. That is the expectation. Yet when modern scanning techniques were applied to the Great Pyramid, the data suggested something else. Something that does not announce itself with chambers or corridors, but with absence. A region beneath the structure that behaves differently from the rest of the stone mass. A zone that does not align cleanly with the known internal architecture. Not dramatic enough to be a hidden room, yet distinct enough to be noticed by instruments designed to detect density, not imagination. This is where the anomaly begins. The area beneath the pyramid has long been assumed to be structurally conservative. Ancient builders, working without modern materials or reinforcement methods, would have avoided unnecessary complexity at the base. Stability would have been prioritized above all else. The deeper the structure, the more predictable its internal composition should become. And for the most part, that assumption holds. But not entirely. Recent scans do not reveal a dramatic underground chamber filled with artifacts or secrets. They reveal something far more subtle and far more troubling for structural logic. A pattern that deviates quietly from what the rest of the pyramid suggests. A zone where density behaves differently. Where the internal composition does not resolve into the solid continuity expected at that depth. At first glance, such irregularities could be dismissed as noise. Natural variations in stone. Limitations of scanning resolution. Statistical artifacts. These explanations are not unreasonable. In fact, they are the first assumptions made by the researchers themselves. But as the data was reviewed, compared, and cross-referenced, the anomaly persisted. It did not disappear with higher confidence intervals. It did not smooth out under different models. It remained present across multiple passes, subtle yet consistent, always in the same region. Always beneath the structure, not aligned with any known corridor or chamber. This is not how errors behave. Errors scatter. They fluctuate. They fail to repeat with precision. This feature did not. The deeper problem is not what this region might be, but where it is located. In ancient stone construction, placement matters more than shape. Builders could compensate for irregular blocks, imperfect cuts, and natural stone flaws. What they could not easily compensate for was misplacement of mass at critical load-bearing zones, and yet the scans suggest that beneath the pyramid's core, there exists a region that does not fully conform to the surrounding density. Not hollow, not empty, but altered. As if the stone arrangement changes its behavior at that depth. No ancient text describes such a feature. No excavation confirms it. No visible entrance leads to it. And still the data indicates something is there. To understand why this matters, one must step away from mystery and focus on mechanics. The Great Pyramid is not simply a pile of stone. It is a system designed to manage enormous compressive forces. Millions of tons of limestone and granite exert pressure downward, outward, and inward simultaneously. Every internal space, every void, every passage alters how those forces move through the structure. Known chambers are positioned carefully to avoid catastrophic stress concentrations. Their locations make sense within the logic of load distribution. Even the controversial relieving chambers above the king's chamber follow a clear structural purpose. But the anomaly beneath the pyramid does not announce such a purpose. It sits where continuity would be expected, where mass should be uninterrupted, where deviation introduces questions rather than solutions. And that is the core of the problem. If this region was intentionally created, it would imply a design decision that runs counter to conservative ancient engineering principles. If it was unintentional, it would suggest an error left uncorrected in a structure otherwise defined by precision. Neither option fits comfortably. The possibility that this feature is natural must also be considered. Geological formations beneath the plateau are complex. Variations in bedrock density exist. Cavities, fractures, and irregular layers are not uncommon in limestone environments. But the anomaly does not align cleanly with known geological patterns either. It appears too localized, too contained. too specifically positioned beneath the structure's core rather than randomly distributed. This places the feature in an uncomfortable middle ground. Not clearly artificial, not clearly natural, existing in a space where classification becomes difficult. And this is precisely why it matters. Most archaeological debates revolve around interpretation, artifacts, inscriptions, cultural context. But this anomaly exists below interpretation. It exists at the level of physical behavior, of matter responding to forces, of stone interacting with weight. Stone does not lie, it does not exaggerate, it does not mythologize. It responds only to pressure, gravity, and time. And according to the scans, the stone beneath the pyramid behaves differently in one specific region. The question is not whether this proves anything extraordinary. It does not. The question is why this deviation exists at all. Why, in a structure defined by repetition, symmetry, and predictability, does the base contain a region that quietly refuses to conform? This is not a mystery of legends or lost knowledge. It is a structural question, a problem of mass, placement, and intent. And it is one that cannot be answered by surface-level observation. Because whatever this anomaly represents, it is not meant to be seen. It exists below the monument, below history, below the stories we tell about the pyramid. And understanding it requires looking not at what the structure reveals, but at what it conceals by necessity. In the next part, we will move closer to the anomaly itself, not by speculating about its purpose, but by examining how deep it lies, how it relates to the known internal layout, and why its position makes it difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Because sometimes the most important questions are not found in what ancient builders chose to show, but in what they buried beneath everything else. Depth, placement, and structural logic. Understanding whether an anomaly matters begins with one question: location. In large stone structures where something exists is often more important than what it is. A cavity near the surface behaves very differently from a void near the base. A deviation near an edge can be tolerated. A deviation near the core cannot. This is why the position of the anomaly beneath the Great Pyramid immediately raised concern among researchers. Not because it was dramatic, but because it appeared in a zone that should be structurally uneventful. The pyramid's internal architecture is already well documented. The descending passage, the ascending passage, the grand gallery, the queen's chamber, the king's chamber, and the relieving spaces above it all follow a vertical logic that rises from the bedrock upward. These elements are aligned, measured, and intentionally placed to manage stress as the structure climbs. Below these known spaces, however, the expectation is different. The deeper one goes into the pyramid's base, the more uniform the stone should become. Ancient builders had no incentive to introduce complexity at depth. There is no symbolic value underground, no ceremonial function, only load and resistance. This is where the scans become difficult to ignore. The anomaly appears beneath the central mass of the pyramid, offset from known passages, and not aligned with the vertical stack of chambers above. Its depth places it within the zone where compressive forces are highest and where structural continuity is most critical. In simple terms, this is the last place where irregularity should exist. The scanning method used to detect this feature is designed to observe density variations, not empty space alone. It does not see walls or rooms in the conventional sense. Instead, it measures how particles pass through stone, how often they are absorbed, and how their paths are altered by mass. This matters because the anomaly does not present as a clean void. If it were an open chamber, the signal would be obvious. The density difference would be sharp. Instead, what appears is a softer deviation, a region where the stone behaves as though it is arranged differently, not missing but altered. This distinction is critical. Natural fractures in limestone typically form along predictable planes. They follow stress lines, faults, or water pathways. When they occur, they tend to extend outward, not remain neatly contained. Their shapes are irregular, branching, and inconsistent. The anomaly beneath the pyramid does not behave like that. Its boundaries appear relatively contained. Its position is stable across scans. Its relationship to the surrounding stone is consistent. These are not characteristics of random geological noise. At the same time, it does not match known construction techniques either. Ancient Egyptian builders did create subterranean spaces. The descending passage itself is cut deep into the bedrock. But such features are direct, intentional, and accessible. They have clear geometric logic and clear entrances. This feature has neither. There is no known access point, no corridor leading toward it, no historical record suggesting its existence. And yet, the data suggests a region where stone density shifts in a way that cannot be explained by uniform packing alone. To understand why this is problematic, consider how pressure behaves in a pyramid. Weight is transferred downward through layers of stone, dispersing outward toward the base. The core carries immense compressive loads, while the outer casing helps distribute that force evenly. Any internal deviation near the center risks creating stress concentrations. Ancient builders were acutely aware of this. The placement of granite beams, the angle of passages, and the stepped arrangement of relieving spaces all reflect an understanding of load management. Even small miscalculations could result in cracking or collapse over time. The pyramid has stood for thousands of years. This suggests that whatever exists beneath it is not actively destabilizing the structure, which leads to a narrow set of possibilities. Either the anomaly is minor enough not to disrupt load paths, or it was intentionally designed to coexist with them. Both scenarios raise questions. If the feature is minor, why does it appear consistently across scans? Why does it register as a distinct deviation rather than blending into background noise? If it is intentional, why place it there at all? There is no practical advantage to introducing complexity at that depth. Any functional purpose would need to justify the risk. Yet no obvious function presents itself. Another important detail is alignment. Known internal features follow the pyramid's axis closely. They are oriented with remarkable precision relative to the cardinal directions and to one another. This anomaly does not appear to follow that same strict alignment. It is slightly offset. Not enough to suggest randomness, but enough to suggest it is not part of the primary architectural plan as we understand it. This creates a structural ambiguity. The feature does not integrate cleanly with the pyramid's known systems, yet it exists within them. Some researchers have suggested that the anomaly could represent a construction phase artifact, a temporary void left during building, later filled or partially collapsed. This explanation is plausible in theory, but difficult to reconcile with the location. Temporary construction spaces are typically near the surface or along access routes. Creating such a space deep within the base would require additional excavation and later infill, increasing labor rather than reducing it. Others propose that it could be a natural bedrock irregularity incorporated into the design. Ancient builders were known to adapt to the terrain. They did not always impose perfect geometry on imperfect foundations, but adaptation usually leaves visible consequences above ground. Adjustments propagate upward. They affect chamber alignment, passage angles, or casing symmetry. No such effects are clearly observed here. The pyramid above this region appears uncompromised. Its geometry remains precise. Its known chambers align as expected. This suggests that if the anomaly influenced construction, it was either compensated for deliberately or isolated structurally. Both imply awareness, and awareness implies intent. At this stage, it is important to be precise with language. The data does not indicate a hidden chamber. It does not indicate a secret room. It does not indicate advanced technology or lost knowledge. What it indicates is a mismatch between expectation and observation. A region beneath the pyramid where stone density behaves differently than predicted by conservative construction logic. That alone does not rewrite history, but it does complicate it. Because when dealing with ancient structures, complexity is usually visible. It announces itself through corridors, inscriptions, or architectural flourishes. Here, the complexity is silent, buried beneath millions of tons of stone, unaffected by time, and detectable only through methods that ancient builders could not have anticipated, but which modern science cannot easily dismiss. In the next part, we will confront the most uncomfortable question raised by this anomaly. Not what it is, but why existing explanations struggle to fully account for it. Because when a structure obeys every known rule except one, it is often that exception that deserves the closest attention. Where the model stops, explaining, up to this point, everything discussed can still exist within acceptable uncertainty. Variations in stone, measurement limits, conservative assumptions that may not fully capture ancient construction realities. These are reasonable positions. But part 3 is where the explanations begin to strain. Not because the anomaly becomes more dramatic, but because every standard framework used to dismiss it starts to contradict another. In archaeology and engineering, models are built to reduce ambiguity. They do not need to explain everything, but they must remain internally consistent. When a model requires multiple unrelated exceptions to remain intact, it stops being explanatory and becomes defensive. This is what begins to happen here. The most common explanation offered is geological irregularity. Limestone is not uniform. Bedrock beneath the Giza Plateau contains fissures, density gradients, and natural voids. This is true. However, geological explanations rely on probability. Irregularities occur where conditions allow them. They follow stress patterns, fault lines, and erosion pathways. The anomaly beneath the pyramid does not follow these patterns cleanly. It does not extend outward in a way consistent with natural fracture systems. It does not taper or branch as most limestone voids do. And most importantly, it appears positioned beneath the structural core rather than offset randomly within the plateau. For the geological explanation to hold, several conditions must align simultaneously. The irregularity must be localized, contained, and coincidentally positioned beneath the most load-sensitive region of the structure, without affecting construction above it. This is not impossible, but it is increasingly specific. The next explanation is construction phase artifact. The idea that a temporary space existed during building and was later filled or partially collapsed. In theory, this could explain a density variation without requiring long-term intent. In practice, this explanation creates new problems. Temporary voids are created to reduce labor, not increase it. Creating a space deep beneath the core requires excavation, planning, and later correction. It introduces risk rather than reducing it. There is no clear incentive for ancient builders to do this at that depth. Additionally, if the space had been fully filled later, the density should resolve back toward uniformity. Partial infill would likely produce irregular signals, not a consistent deviation across scans. This explanation requires assuming a rare construction choice, executed deep within the structure, that left no visible trace above and no record in construction logic elsewhere. Again, not impossible, but increasingly narrow. Another explanation sometimes proposed is measurement artifact. Limitations of scanning resolution, interpretation bias, or signal interference. This argument is appealing because it avoids the need to explain the anomaly at all. The problem is repetition. Measurement artifacts tend to fluctuate. They shift location slightly. They weaken or disappear under alternative models or repeated passes. The anomaly beneath the pyramid does not behave this way. Its signal persists. It does not sharpen dramatically, but it does not dissolve either. It remains present across datasets, which forces analysts to acknowledge it, even if reluctantly. At this point, the explanations begin to conflict. If it is geological, its containment and position are unusual. If it is a construction artifact, its depth and persistence are inefficient. If it is a measurement error, its consistency is unexpected. Each explanation can account for one aspect of the anomaly, but none can account for all of them without introducing additional assumptions. This is where models quietly fail. Not loudly, not catastrophically, but through accumulation. There is another factor rarely addressed directly. Intent does not need to imply purpose. Modern discussions often collapse intent into function. If something was intentional, it must have had a use. If it had a use, we should be able to identify it. This is a false equivalence. In large constructions, some decisions are made to manage uncertainty rather than achieve function. Builders may introduce features as buffers, contingencies, or responses to unknown variables encountered during construction. Such decisions are not symbolic, they are pragmatic. If ancient builders encountered an unexpected condition beneath the structure, they may have chosen to isolate, redistribute, or accommodate it rather than eliminate it. That accommodation could leave a detectable signature without leaving a visible structure. This possibility is rarely discussed because it does not fit clean narratives. It does not suggest advanced knowledge or secret chambers. It suggests adaptation. But even this explanation struggles with placement. Adaptations typically propagate. They leave traces. They alter geometry above. Yet the pyramid remains remarkably consistent in its upper architecture. This suggests that if accommodation occurred, it was carefully contained, which again raises awareness. Another uncomfortable issue is silence. There is no textual reference to such a feature, no inscriptions, no later records. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially for features never intended to be accessed or revisited. The pyramid was sealed. Its construction methods were not documented in detail. Knowledge transmission relied on tradition rather than records. What is documented tends to focus on ritual, symbolism, and visible achievement. Structural contingencies rarely make it into cultural memory. This leaves us with a problem that is not mystical, but methodological. The anomaly exists in data, but resists classification. It does not trigger extraordinary conclusions, yet it refuses to dissolve into ordinary ones. This is the most difficult kind of anomaly to deal with, because it cannot be dismissed without stretching models, and it cannot be embraced without inventing narratives. It occupies a narrow space where the only honest position is uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. In science and archaeology, unresolved questions are often treated as temporary, something to be solved later when tools improve or data increases. But some questions persist not because tools are insufficient, but because the frameworks used to interpret them are incomplete. The Great Pyramid has been studied intensely but within a limited set of assumptions. That its builders followed conservative logic. That deviations would be visible. That underground complexity would announce itself clearly. The anomaly beneath the structure challenges none of these assumptions directly. It simply refuses to align with all of them at once. And that is enough to matter. In the next part, we will examine why this kind of anomaly is often left unresolved. Not because it lacks importance, but because acknowledging it forces a choice between competing explanations that no longer fit neatly together. Sometimes the most revealing aspect of an ancient structure is not what it tells us, but what it forces us to admit we do not fully understand. The questions that remain uncomfortable. Not all unanswered questions are treated equally. Some are openly acknowledged. They are framed as puzzles awaiting better tools or future discoveries. Others are quietly set aside. Not denied, but rarely pursued with urgency. The anomaly beneath the pyramid falls into the second category. This is not because it lacks data, but because of what it demands in return. To address it seriously requires stepping outside a narrow range of explanations that feel safe, familiar, and professionally comfortable. In archaeology, there is an unspoken hierarchy of uncertainty. Questions about symbolism, ritual, or meaning are allowed to remain open-ended. Structural questions, especially those involving physical behavior of materials, are expected to resolve cleanly. Stone is supposed to be honest, predictable, governed by rules that do not bend easily. When it does not behave as expected, the instinct is not curiosity, but containment. One reason for this is practical. Large-scale reinterpretations are costly. They require reanalysis, remodeling, and sometimes public correction. They invite scrutiny not just of the anomaly itself, but of the assumptions that preceded it. It is easier to classify an anomaly as marginal than to reopen foundational questions. Another reason is institutional inertia. Archaeological understanding of the Great Pyramid is not the work of a single study. It is a layered consensus built over generations. Each new interpretation rests upon those before it. Disrupting one element risks destabilizing others. This does not mean researchers are dishonest. It means they are cautious. Caution, however, has a side effect. It narrows the range of questions that are considered productive. The anomaly beneath the pyramid is rarely described in primary terms. It is often framed indirectly as a limitation of scanning resolution or an area requiring further study. This language is accurate but incomplete. What is rarely discussed is why the feature persists across analyses, or why its position continues to resist clean categorization. These are not sensational questions. They are structural ones. Another factor contributing to avoidance is scale. The Great Pyramid is already exceptional. Its size, precision, and longevity challenge modern expectations. Introducing additional complexity beneath it risks overwhelming interpretation. There is a psychological threshold beyond which adding anomalies begins to feel destabilizing rather than enlightening. So the tendency is to simplify. This simplification often takes the form of reduction. The anomaly is treated as a footnote rather than a focal point. It is acknowledged but not explored deeply. Its implications are left implicit, yet implications exist regardless of attention. The anomaly suggests that ancient builders either encountered conditions they adapted to silently or incorporated features whose purposes were not meant to be revisited. Neither option aligns perfectly with the idea of a fully transparent, fully intentional architectural plan. It introduces ambiguity into a structure often held up as a model of clarity. There is also the issue of narrative containment. Public discourse around the pyramid is polarized. On one side, conservative explanations seek to avoid speculation at all costs. On the other, sensational narratives inflate every irregularity into proof of extraordinary claims. The anomaly fits comfortably into neither camp. It is too subtle for sensationalism, too persistent for dismissal. As a result, it occupies a blind spot. Researchers are understandably cautious about how such features are communicated. Misinterpretation by the public can lead to distorted conclusions. But excessive caution can lead to silence. Silence, in turn, shapes understanding just as powerfully as explanation. What is not emphasized is often assumed to be unimportant. Yet importance is not determined by volume or visibility. In engineering, small deviations at critical points can have outsized significance. A slight change in density at depth may not alter appearance, but it can reveal decisions, constraints, or conditions otherwise lost to time. Another uncomfortable aspect is that the anomaly challenges linear thinking about construction. We tend to imagine ancient building projects as executing a fixed plan from start to finish. In reality, large constructions are adaptive processes. They respond to terrain, materials, and unforeseen challenges. If the builders encountered an unexpected condition beneath the pyramid, they may have responded pragmatically rather than symbolically. Such responses leave traces that are not meant to be interpreted later. They are solutions, not messages. This possibility complicates interpretation because it removes intention from visibility. It suggests that some aspects of the pyramid were never meant to be known, not because they were secret, but because they were resolved and forgotten. Modern analysis, however, brings them back into focus. The discomfort arises from the realization that our models may be incomplete not because ancient builders were mysterious, but because our frameworks prioritize outcomes over processes. We study what remains visible, we reconstruct what can be measured. But adaptation, compromise, and contingency often leave the faintest signatures. The anomaly beneath the pyramid may be one such signature. It does not demand a radical rewrite of history, but it does demand humility. It asks us to accept that even our most studied structures may contain decisions we cannot fully reconstruct. This is not failure, it is a boundary between what data can show and what interpretation can safely claim. In the final part, we will step back from explanation altogether. Not to offer conclusions, but to consider what it means when a structure as familiar as the Great Pyramid still resists full understanding. Because sometimes the most honest ending is not resolution, but recognition. What remains after explanation? When all available explanations are placed side by side, one truth becomes unavoidable. The anomaly beneath the pyramid does not force a new story. It forces a pause. In most cases, knowledge advances by accumulation. New data replaces old assumptions. Better tools refine earlier conclusions. Over time, uncertainty shrinks. But some questions resist this process. Not because they are unsolvable, but because they sit at the intersection of limits. Limits of data, limits of models, and limits of interpretation. The feature beneath the pyramid occupies that intersection. It is not dramatic enough to rewrite history, not ambiguous enough to be ignored, not visible enough to be contextualized through artifacts or inscriptions. It simply exists. And that existence, quietly confirmed through repeated measurement, is what makes it significant. One of the most persistent misconceptions about ancient structures is that every element must carry meaning. That builders encoded intention into every stone. That complexity implies symbolism. Reality is often less poetic. Large constructions are shaped by compromise, by decisions made under pressure, by conditions encountered rather than chosen. Many of these decisions are invisible once the structure is complete. They do not announce themselves. They do not seek interpretation. They leave behind only subtle traces. The anomaly beneath the pyramid may be one such trace. If so, it represents not mystery, but process. A moment during construction where something did not align perfectly with expectation, and a solution was applied that worked well enough to disappear from memory. This interpretation is not satisfying in the traditional sense. It offers no revelation, no hidden chamber, no lost knowledge, but it offers something else. It reminds us that even the most iconic structures are products of human problem-solving, not abstract perfection. They were built by people responding to constraints, uncertainties, and real physical conditions. Stone remembers those moments, even when history does not. At the same time, the anomaly resists being fully absorbed into this explanation as well. Its containment, its persistence, and its placement remain unusual. Enough to keep the question open. And perhaps that is the point. Not every question demands resolution. Some serve as markers of the boundary between what we know and what we assume. The Great Pyramid has been studied for centuries, its dimensions catalogued, its chambers mapped, its materials analyzed, and yet, beneath it, something subtle remains unresolved. This does not diminish our understanding, it sharpens it, because understanding is not the elimination of mystery, but the recognition of where certainty ends. In modern analysis, there is pressure to close loops, to classify every anomaly, to ensure that nothing remains unexplained for too long. But history does not operate on deadlines. Some features persist not because they hide secrets, but because they remind us that knowledge is always provisional. The anomaly beneath the pyramid does not ask us to believe in anything extraordinary. It asks us to accept that even our most familiar monuments may contain details that exceed our current frameworks. And that acceptance is not weakness, it is intellectual honesty. As scanning technologies improve and models evolve, this feature may one day resolve into something ordinary, or it may remain an outlier, quietly resisting closure. Either outcome is acceptable. What matters is that we recognize the anomaly for what it is, not a conclusion, but a boundary. A boundary where data ends and interpretation begins. And boundaries are important. They tell us not just what we know, but how carefully we must tread when claiming certainty about the past. The pyramid will remain. The stone will continue to bear its weight. And beneath it, the anomaly will persist, not demanding attention but rewarding it. Because sometimes the most enduring legacy of ancient structures is not the answers they provide, but the questions they leave behind.